Hello beautiful people, my name is Venti and today I'm going to be bringing you a series review for L.L. McKinney's Nightmareverse series. I'm going to do my best to keep this review as spoiler-free as possible, barring a specifically demarcated spoiler section with timestamps that I'll include in the description box below. However, considering this is a series review, please be aware that there might be some spoilers about the preceding books in the series when I'm talking about any given book. This series is packed full of so much stuff between a absolutely breakneck plot and a lot of character inter-involvement and a world building that is just to die for. So it's for the best to just get started with a brief overview of what the series looks like. The Nightmareverse opens with A Blade So Black, where we are introduced to our protagonist, Allison Kingston, or Alice. After Allison's father passes away, the negative emotions that she feels manifest themselves physically into a being known as a nightmare. Nightmares are basically human emotion from Earth made manifest. In Wonderland, which is a sort of parallel dimension to ours that both feeds into and is fed by our universe, those negative emotions take physical form and sometimes make their way across the veil and into the human world. And because they are made of negativity, that is what they feed on. So this nightmare latches onto Alice and is dead set on destroying her. And Alice is a little unique in that she can see the nightmare for what it truly is, a monster rather than some sort of mortal and mundane manifestation of what that sort of thing would be. And Allison would be in a whole lot of trouble if one of the guardians of the veil, Addison Hadda, doesn't come to her rescue. Upon realizing that Allison can see both him and the nightmare, Addison takes Alice under her wing and allows her to channel the grief and frustration that she has from losing her father into becoming a guardian of the veil. While the denizens of Wonderland can chase down nightmares and guard the veil, it is up to human beings on Earth to be able to actually kill the nightmares and purge them. As we are the source of nightmares, so we too must be their destruction. And Allison proves to be an incredibly adept hunter herself. But a la Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Allison is also a high school girl, and naturally this double life is something she needs to keep secret, especially from her mother, who is super worried about Alice being a black girl in Atlanta, Georgia, where recently another black girl was killed by the police. Allison's reprieve comes from her high school friends Courtney and Chess, the former of whom knows all about Alice's double life and does her best to cover for her when Alice has to take emergency trips into Wonderland. But one day, after a purge gone wrong that Alice has to go into Wonderland to refix, she is encountered by a dark knight, a presence in Wonderland who she's never encountered before but is a formidable fighter and who bids her to give a message to Addison, one that ends up doing him a tremendous amount of harm and that sets off the entire quest of the series as a whole. With her mentor dying and out of commission, and with some personal problems happening between Alice and her friends, Allison ends up needing to go on a quest through Wonderland to find the Eye and the Heart, two magical artifacts which will allow her to purge the sickness that has infected Addison's body. And with the help of two fellow Dreamwalkers, Dee and Dem, the guardians of the Northern Gate from Russia, Alice embarks on a mission that takes her throughout Wonderland and into the palace of the Queen, who ended up exiling Addison into being a guardian of the veil and out of Wonderland in the first place. However, between complications that arise both in her mundane world and things that happen in Wonderland by way of the Black Knight, Alice realizes that things are a little bit more than they seem, and the darkness that's affecting Addison is actually larger than it may appear. So even if she wins the battle to save him, that does not necessarily mean that she has won the war for Wonderland and the world. And the price of that battle ends up being a little steeper than she initially anticipated it would be, with the blights of Wonderland affecting some of her Earthside allies as well. The story is followed by the sequel, A Dream So Dark. Some of Alice's former allies have been corrupted, some of Alice's former enemies are turning out to be a little more complicated than they seem, and the face of the new big bad is brought to light. Through a dangerous set of circumstances, Alice's mom is brought into the fold and into the know as Wonderland begins to bleed more into the mundane world and things get more complex, which is very important because Alice is going to need all the help she can get against this new foe, a corrupted creature made of the same stuff as the nightmares called the Bloody Lady. Despite being brought to great lows, Alice and company end up rallying together and facing off with the Bloody Lady in what looks like a total victory for Team Good, and all seems to be well. That is, until the events of the final book of the trilogy, A Crown So Cursed. At the opening, Alice and her friends are living their newly found happy life with no complications from Wonderland aside the regular guardian stuff to occupy her time. Alice is getting close to her friends again and repairing old bonds, but as it turns out, the Bloody Lady is back and she has essentially Super Saiyaned, and with her growth of power, the veils between Wonderland and the real world are getting increasingly blurred. In order to save Wonderland and thus save the world as well, Alice and her friends have to return to Wonderland to stop the evil evil at its source. And when they get there, their bonds are tested, the secrets of Wonderland are revealed, and Alice's muchness is put to the ultimate test to save her family and everyone she loves. Okay, and that is basically the goings on of what happens from books 1 to 3 with as few spoilers as I could possibly include while still giving a relatively concise overview. Now let's get to the good stuff of the review. Starting with my favorite element of just about any story, which is the characters. For the most part, I feel that character is where McKinney shines the strongest, especially with the character interrelationships and bonds that she creates between folks. The relationships between allies tend to be complex and full of a tremendous amount of love and organic banter, while also leaving room for interpersonal conflicts that happen even with the happiest pairs of people. And equally complex, if not more so, are the interrelationships between foes. Despite there being a lot of black and white and obviously red color imagery in this series, I found that the characters of McKinney's world tend to fall into shades of gray most often, where even if things are not excused that certain villainous characters do, and their actions aren't necessarily justified, when you get into their head and look at things from their point of view, things begin to make sense. Oftentimes, even the greatest evil is caused by fear at the root of it, and the great part about a story like this is that community ends up being the thing that resolves a lot of these fears for some people, and for those for whom it can't be resolved, community triumphs against the isolation that fear brings. And because the characters are so individuated and their voices are so unique for the characters whose point of view we get to exist in throughout the story, you get a pretty solid sense of who everyone is. Obviously, the strongest example of this is Alice as our protagonist, but the vast majority of the supporting characters as well are just as strong as she is, and so she doesn't stand out as especially great, which is ideal for any sort of ensemble cast thing. They all blend pretty seamlessly into a cast of characters where you find something that you can love in each and every one. I would say probably the weakest characters for me personally were the other Dreamwalkers, so Dee and Dem from the Northern Gate and Haruka from the Eastern Gate. Despite sort of being at Dreamwalking for a little bit longer than Alice, they don't always measure up to her ability, and that's not just because of some spoilery reasons that are gotten into later on in the book, but also kind of because of how their characters are written. Dee and Dem are often relegated to the comic relief, which isn't bad by any means, but when somebody becomes that one note, especially when held up against the backdrop of other really complex and rich characters, they do tend to fall a little more flat. And while Haruka is described as immensely complicated, and I do enjoy the hints between herself and Alice of the sort of mutual attraction that the two of them have, because hey, these are teenagers, they're gonna have those fluttery feelings about one another all the time, and that's gonna be like a pretty intense preoccupation for the characters of a series like this. On occasion, it did feel that Haruka got a little bit of like the subservient Asian woman stereotype kind of thrown in on her. I don't think this was an intentional characterization choice. Frankly, I feel that it might just be because she didn't get as much page time because there are so many other sort of more focal characters that were being focused on, and Haruka was just sort of fine. She didn't have any sort of great deep interpersonal stuff that was going on with her that would bring her more into the forefront. But we do really focus on her kind of caregiving a lot, and while I was happy to see that Alice was being cared for, not just as our protagonist, but as a Black woman, a Black young girl who don't often in our literature and media get to have people care for them so like open-heartedly. The fact that she was sort of the primary East Asian character that we had and she was relegated into that role didn't necessarily sit the rightest with me. But on the other hand, of course, we have Alice's real world, real life Atlanta friends, Chess and Courtney, with whom Alice has something of a tumultuous relationship, but ultimately there's a bond of sort of love and like a ride or die-ness that's there from the start all the way to the finish, and that's so delightful to see. And even more than them, Alice's relationship with her blood family, so her mom and her Nana Kay, is so strong. Even her father, who has passed before the beginning of the first book, is so present in her sort of internal monologue and is a key player in the way that Alice ends up growing over the story and overcoming many of the obstacles that happen to her over the course of the plot. In particular, I loved Alice's relationship with her mom and the way that it developed, where at the beginning Alice felt a little bit resentful, not just because she had to keep secrets from her mom, but because after her father died and her mom was plunged into a tremendous amount of grief, Alice sort of had to pick herself up by her bootstraps and was sucked into this world of dream walking, which isn't a safe thing for a child to be doing. because there wasn't that much support being given at home. And then once her mom had sort of reached an acceptance sort of area with her grief, she tried to mother Alice a little more, and Alice was naturally bucking up against that. So watching their relationship go from that sort of fraught thing, but still having an undercurrent of tremendous love and trust, and through a growing of honesty, through a revealing of secrets, that love and that trust only growing and those bonds only getting stronger, it was really healing and beautiful to see. I love a good, complicated mother-daughter relationship. And on the other hand, but similarly fantastically done, we have the characters of Wonderland. We have Addison Hatta, we have the poet Maddie, who is with him in the bar. It is the Wonderland pub. That is where the gateway is that Alice goes into Wonderland through. And when I say a poet, I do mean a healer, because in the lore of Wonderland, which I'll get to in a minute, poets, who are people who talk kind of funny, end up being able to create potions and draughts and things. We also have the guardians of the other gates. Up in the north, we have the Duchess, and in the east, we have Romy, the Duchess being the Duchess from the Wonderland mythos, and Romy being sort of akin to the caterpillar, the "who are you" guy. The royal family, the red and white queens, the white princess, Zelon the white knight, who is the princess's guard, and even the baddies like the Black Knight and the Bloody Lady. As the books go on and we get more points of view from all of them, we get not just implied backstory, which is already really great and feels rich and lived in by all of these characters, we get actual visible backstory of all of them too, which explains their interrelationships in a deeper level. A direct insight to the past, particularly from a character's own point of view, shows and directly shapes the attitudes that those characters have toward one another in the present day, and deeply impacts how they behave toward one another. Speaking of, I really enjoyed the addition of the point of view chapters from other characters' heads, just because I feel like it gives a greater depth and a nuance to the story. It allows for additional depth to be gleaned more organically for things that Alice has no way of actually gaining firsthand context for. And also when combined with Alice's point of view, because she and another character might have a very, very different feeling about a certain event or about a certain character, you are able to, as a reader, put the pieces together for yourself and kind of find a truth somewhere in the middle of their often very disparate points of view, which I always find very fascinating. Shifting from characters into one of my favorite aspects of any sort of fantasy story, and that is world building. I feel that it was incredibly strong, especially in the first two books. In book one, we get a lot of the establishing of the Wonderland lore. We get thrown headfirst into this sort of technicolor, beautiful, very like 90s anime Sailor Moon, but also very clearly Lewis Carroll Wonderland inspired place. I think it's very clear that McKinney loves the source material, but also is very much going to put her own spin on things, and it only enriches the depth of what was already there as a foundation. So not only are the landscapes stunning and very, very much disparate from what happens in the mundane world, Wonderland is very much like a dream world sort of thing going on. Ella McKinney also gives just enough backstory that it feels organic and earned within the story without it having a sort of taking over the current plot type of effect, in terms of giving the socio-political history of Wonderland and why things are happening the way that they are now about Wonderland's ruling family. One of the central themes of the Nightmareverse, at least for me, is grief and the way that it can shape people, especially if they don't necessarily have a community to help them get through it. The circumstances that happened to Wonderland's royal family, starting with the Black Queen, who was the primary queen, and then once she disappears mysteriously, between her daughters, the Red Queen and the White Queen, is truly at the heart of and shapes the entirety of the plot. And I love when things are intermarried in that sort of way, when world impacts plot, impacts characters, impacts world, and vice versa. It's still very much Alice's story, and it is very much Alice-centered. However, the impact of history and the history of grief specifically, and the way that vengeance, to avoid too much spoilers, plays into the way that people behave and the way that they sort of set bad things into motion, is really, really important and cannot be understated as both an impetus for moving the plot forward and also directly impactful of the world, especially because in Wonderland, again, negative feelings literally manifest themselves into things that can harm you and will harm you if given half the chance. So in the first book, we get a tremendous amount of very rich lore. And in the second book, chef's kiss, as all sequels ought to do, that is expanded upon. We see literally more of the world. We see more clearly not just the sort of royal Game of Thrones-y facing parts of Wonderland, but we also see the way that those machinations on that sort of high ruling level have impacted the small folk and the sort of fiefs of Wonderland, if you will. We very much get the pseudo-medieval sort of thing with queens and kings and knights, and also like serfs who just sort of live upon the land as well. We also see a variety of means of transportation with the dragons, for example, and we learn that the gates aren't sort of one-to-one immediately pressed up against one another. Wonderland and Earth are not immediately touching, but there is a sort of in-between space known as the in-between, and it is kind of a mashup of both Earth and Wonderland, so things get even crazier there because two things can be real at once, and traversing through it is quite hard if you don't know what you're doing. Again, in book 2, we are introduced to more characters who feel a little bit like cameos from the Wonderland mythos, which is another thing I very much love. And you'll notice that I mentioned that this is true for books 1 and 2, and that I haven't necessarily mentioned book 3, and I feel that I struggled most with the world building aspects of book 3, naturally, because it is the concluding aspect of the story. The sort of building up of the foundation had to be done prior to then, but I do feel that it a little bit fell off come book 3, not necessarily because I felt it hadn't been enriched and enlivened prior to then, and obviously as the bad guys did level up, the world building of them, the lore of the nightmares and the way that they gain their powers, and the Bloody Lady and where she draws her powers from, that was obviously expanded upon. However, there was less work done to keep a continuity and keep things making sense. There were, I guess you'd call them plot holes more than world holes, really. We still do get a lot of development and growth, especially in terms of certain revelations that happen about the royal family of Wonderland by the time book 3 rolls around. And I think where I struggle with that is that the evidence and the proof for that weren't seeded earlier. I feel like with any sort of secondary world thing, you are not bound by the logic of our mundane world, but you are bound by the logic that you've created internally for your own world. And what helps a lot with keeping there from needing to be a tremendous amount of suspension of disbelief, what allows for that world and that internal logic to feel believable, is if you set it up from the beginning to feel like, oh, it is inevitable that this is the conclusion of what has happened. And in many ways, we did get a lot of seeding for something that could be adjacent to what happened. I'm not explaining this very well. Once I get to the spoilery part, I'll elaborate a little further about what I mean here. But I feel like this leads me into the sort of third element that I wanted to cover in this review, and that is plot. And this is very much where I struggled with the Nightmareverse the most. In earlier reviews of the Nightmareverse, particularly of A Blade So Black, the first book, I have noted that I have some trouble with the pacing, particularly at the very, very start of the book, where we open with a flashback, then several months pass and we have a secondary flashback, and only then at the third part do we enter the primary timeline of the story. I'll leave my story graph review where I go into it, I think, in a little bit more depth below, but basically what I said there as a sort of doctoring fix for this would be to mash the two prologues together into one sort of slightly longer prologue, and then jump into the primary storyline, just so that there is a little less like problems with getting centered into what timeline we're in, what we know, who we know, and who our primary characters are. I say mashing up rather than cutting one because the information gleaned in either prologue is equally important, I feel, to the creation of Alice's character and in kind of getting her to where she is. And by the time I got to the third book, where so much stuff was happening all at once, to the point where I felt like, okay, maybe we could actually split this into 2 books and turn this trilogy into a quartet, allow certain things to breathe more and plug up certain plot holes that have arisen because there just isn't enough room to address these sort of more minor things. It got me thinking, where I think my problem is not in the way that the pacing is done in these books. It is in the format that this series is told. I think that the Nightmareverse is screaming for an adaptation to a TV series where all of these things, if stretched out over a certain number more of episodes, could actually be tackled more fully. And truly, most of my gripes with the series would be fixed in that sort of way if the series was told in a format that allows for a greater serialization, for more issues, for more, maybe it could be a comic instead. I know that Elle McKinney also writes comics, so that might be what this sort of is a symptom of, actually. Regardless, I'm gonna stick with the TV series thing because I don't want to lose this train of thought, and that's how I formulated it in my head. And if I try to like veer into different directions now. It'll just be a whole thing. So some issues that I had were I felt that in the first book, Alice's and Addison's feelings towards one another in a longer form series where we got to watch those feelings grow a little bit more organically, boom, we instantly resolve any sort of feelings of it being like a little bit insta-lovey. The troubles I had in the third book of certain threads that from previous books and also opened in the third book getting opened and then feeling as though that they were dropped so that the primary main plot could sort of continue trucking along. Spreading things out and allowing a multi-episodic sort of thing where there could be individual B plots for individual episodes. Those things could be resolved in a more organic way while still allowing the main plot to move forward and not sort of waste time. And also, making it a little bit longer would allow for more time in Wonderland, and I feel like considering the breakneckness of the plot in book 3, we didn't get to enjoy that beauty nearly as much. By the time we get to book 3, the sort of whimsicality of Wonderland kind of falls by the wayside, to the point where I didn't feel like we were in this like place with a purple sky and a moon, and there's like cotton candy bubbles that just sort of flit and float around. By the time the third book rolled around, it felt a little bit more like standard sword and sorcery medieval fantasy world. And I had to actively work to remind myself, like, no, we're in Wonderland. I shouldn't be picturing it this way. I should be picturing it more like that way, more technicolor, more bright, more loud. And again, just giving there more space would allow the pace of that third book to slow down to sort of match the pace of the second, which I feel was kind of the pinnacle of the series, and just sort of let us remind ourselves of the whimsicality of Wonderland. Plus, if it was a TV series, we are not needing reminders of it because it's truly all around us all the time. The setting, it's what we're seeing as the background of what's going on with the plot. I don't want it to feel like I'm dunking on book 3 because I feel like for concluding the story, it did what it absolutely had to do. The main plot was still fantastic. I still really loved where Alice's arc went, and with just the mildest suspension of disbelief necessary and just like a couple gripes of, oh, I wish this was seeded a little bit more effectively throughout the rest of the narrative, I was really happy and pleased with how it went. However, there were some elements, some dropped plot holes that I was really excited about that we didn't really get to resolve in book 3 because of the pacing, and those are things I need to get into the spoilery section about, so that's what we're going to start now at this point of the video. I will have a timestamp for when the spoiler section is over and we can reconvene and come to an overall conclusion about this story altogether. Again, I'll have the timestamp in the description box below, so feel free to click on that if you don't want to be spoiled. So I was thrilled when Alice ended up being the Princess of Wonderland. I kind of assumed, given the powers that she developed in book 2, where she had that sort of bubble around her and she was able to wield the Vorpal blade and stuff to create it, that she had something going on in terms of that. For a little bit there, I was like, oh, is this just the muchness that Addison was talking about? Is this just like what being human within Wonderland does, being more real within this world where everything is kind of make-believe, but then the other Dreamwalkers couldn't do it. So I was like, okay, but we know Alice is like super, super muchy. Is that what's going on? But then with Nana Kay giving her a rose necklace, I was like, oh, okay, I know about roses in the world of Alice in Wonderland. This is like an heirloom, and Alice has far, far back in her ancestry some tie to one of the missing queens, or maybe she like had a great-grandmother or something, or maybe even her grandmother was a Dreamwalker previously and was charged with keeping the heart safe by one of the knights. Ultimately, it did feel earned and right that Alice was actually the Princess of Wonderland. However, I don't know that it felt as earned and right that Nana Kay ended up being the Red Queen. I feel like there is a super easy fix to this. You just truly mention the Red Queen's name earlier on in the story, Kashante, and then readers could be like, Nana Kay, oh, the K stands for Kingston. Oh, just kidding. Like, now that it's revealed that she is Kashante, that she's Queen Kashante, that's what the K obviously stands for. But because we aren't given the clue by which we could glean that information earlier on if we are super astute, it's not as impactful when the information is given to us. As it stood, considering that Nana Kay like had her moments of lucidity and knew about these things and very clearly knew that something was up with Alice vis-a-vis dream walking, I feel like it felt cruel for her not to reach out to Alice about this sort of thing and like talk to her about these things, or like during one of her lapses of memory to not lapse into a time when she was in Wonderland and Alice recognizing like, Grandma, how can you know about this sort of stuff? I feel like that would have been an opportunity to just seed the truth of Kashante's identity, and also to make Alice's relationship with her grandmother, which is very like loving and warm, feel more true, because then Grandma's literally looking out for her once she figures these things out. Also, and it's such a minor gripe considering Wonderland is essentially like the Rodgers and Hammerstein Cinderella, the best Cinderella. I will go to my grave saying this, but I feel like when you look at the names of the other Wonderland royals who are by blood related to Alice and obviously her grandma then, Kashante, you have names like Portentia, Odabeth, Odette, Amalia. So it's like one of these things is not like the other. And while I appreciate Elle McKinney being like, nope, she's Black, and I want to like make it very clear that this character is Black, at that point I kind of wish that the other royals' names were a little bit more reflective of that as well. Again, this is just a minor gripe, but it does go back to my wanting the world and the internal logic of the thing to make sense a little bit more. Another thing that threw me off and truly felt a little bit out of left field was the connection between Chess and Humphrey, the former Black Knight, and Addison's former lover. The fact that they are the same guy who then got split, you know, the whole Humpty Dumpty, all the king's horses, all the king's men type of deal, that felt very much like a stretch. I feel like it would have made a little bit more sense that after the Black Knight killed Chess and put some slithe into him, that parts of the Black Knight through that slithe, through that nightmare gunk getting put into Chess, gave Chess the memories and the connection between the two of them, rather than Chess being literally just a Wonderlandian sort of soul shard that was split off and brought into existence. It made for sort of a weird dynamic. I was really excited when I saw the two of them begin to be friends and sort of bond over the shared trauma that the Bloody Lady caused them by sort of taking their autonomy. And I really enjoyed the idea of that sort of being a bridge between the human world and the Wonderland world. I like the two of them as the Wonderland and Earth mirrors of one another to whom the same or very similar thing happened. So having them be the same guy just sort of felt like, oh, like that's not as fun and interesting. And I feel like if you make Humphrey's slithe be the thing that has brought sort of Chester back to life and given him some of this connection and some of this like ability to sword fight and stuff, like you still get the Humpty Dumpty thing of a piece of him is now in somebody else. So Humpty Dumpty literally can't be put back together again without causing direct harm to Chess. And then Chess could be more Cheshire Catty, where he's literally disappearing and reappearing, which both of them can do. Both of them can do that teleportation thing. So I get that their duality of characters is supposed to be both Humpty Dumpty and the Cheshire Cat. I just wish it was a little bit more divided. Also, I felt kind of bad for Courtney in that she is now the only other like actual Earthling, and I kind of wanted Alice to have Earthling friends, like have a slightly stronger tie to Earth again, because with the revelation of her being a Wonderlandian princess, the tie to Wonderland seems even stronger, and I really enjoyed that she was sort of both worlds. That was like a really strong pull of the series for me, so when it, turned out that literally there's just one earthly tie that Alice has, I guess her mom as well, but her mom's going wherever Alice is, it's like, okay, we are fully moving into the secondary world. Whereas the draw of urban fantasy for me is that both worlds are equally real and equally present in the protagonists' lives. Those are sort of the main two things that I had any sort of gripe with. I have slightly smaller other ones. In the second book, we are introduced to a dragon that used to be one of the queen's dragons, who is like really sad and depressed and won't take another rider. And I feel like we were really set up for that dragon to take part in book 3. There were a couple times when Alice and her friends were stuck stranded somewhere and needed to get somewhere crazy fast. And I was like, okay, yeah, naturally, that dragon is coming now. And it's coming to Alice because Alice is a member of the royal family. Duh. But it just never happened. Like, we hear about dragons, and then in the third book, Alice tells Dee and Dem that she is ridden in the basket carried by a dragon, but then there's no mention of a dragon ever again. And that just feels like if you're going to introduce dragons and you're going to set up a MacGuffin or, a Chekhov's gun where a dragon is too depressed and is waiting for his rider, you gotta have the dragon come. You gotta give him a toothless moment. And then similarly, but I think even more egregiously because it was only introduced in book 3 and towards the end of it at that, we get like the original nightmare, like the original creator that gave Portentia her sort of dark powers in the first place. It comes and nearly eviscerates Addison and Humphrey and Chess as they're on their way to help Allison fight Portentia in the sort of final boss battle thing. And then they forget about him. And it's weird. It's as though it was being set up for a continuation for a book 4, but all of my research about the series has shown that this is the conclusion. So I'm like, what was the point? What was the point of introducing this guy if we're not gonna learn more about him? It felt very strange to introduce another sort of a bigger bad like that. If this was a TV series again, then yeah, this is clearly the setup for season 4. It's going to be whatever's happening there. And then we're going to get whatever political intrigue of Alice having to navigate being now a princess and sort of queen ascendant of Wonderland and having to like navigate this new thing in a sort of Game of Thronesy way, but by way of Wonderland, which is another thing I would have loved to see more of. But again, there just simply was no time with the amount of page space we had allotted. I also felt that some of the resolution between the romantic relationships of Addison and Humphrey, for example, were not given the space that they needed to like fully resolve. I feel like by the time the third book rolls around, which, you know, we got evidence for on page, Addison and Alice's relationship is more than just budding. Like, there's very clearly a depth of feeling there, and they're very much like an item. So it felt a little weird that Addison was still having like a lot of these feelings with Humphrey. I feel like it maybe would have felt a little bit more organic and a little bit more honest if he sort of like kept Alice at a little bit more arm's reach until he could resolve some of these feelings. And similarly, because Addison and Alice were, to me, it seemed like in a committed and loving and depth of feeling relationship, it felt a little strange to have Alice continue to like flirt with Haruka. Again, for Alice, I feel like a little bit more leeway gets to be granted because, again, she is a teenager. So like a little bit more hormonalness and like blushy, like will they, won't they, flippy floppy, everything is hormones and everything is feelings vibes make a little bit more sense. But like Addison's like a whole like adult. He's like an immortal being who's been a knight for like a million centuries, and it feels a little strange that he's so immature in his relationships in that capacity. It felt unfair to both Humphrey and to Alice to have that sort of thing be dragged on as much as it was, especially because I feel that that room could have been better spent growing and developing the bond between Alice and Addison further. Anyway, spoilers over. Hello again to my spoiler-free guys. We're just gonna like wrap things up here. I do want it noted that none of my gripes that I have with the series in any way detract from my actual and active enjoyment of the series. When you critique something in such a nitpicky way, it's because you love it and you want it to be the absolute best version of itself that it can be. So the love that I have for the series is what's sort of causing me to dig in and poke and prod at some of these more finer details that I'm sure for some people won't matter at all, because the plot of the story, again, is just really engaging and fast-paced, and the majority of things get resolved as they ought to do. But it would not be an honest review if I did not bring them up, so I'd be remiss not to, and that is all I have to say on that. Overall, I find the Nightmareverse to be an incredibly engaging, very fast-paced, cleverly world-built, and a deeply character-wise emotional series. I think it's perfect for a YA audience. I would recommend it to anyone from like the ages of like 12 to 17. Younger readers could definitely pick it up. Obviously, older readers can also pick it up, but I feel like that is the sweet spot for getting absolutely the most out of a series like this. And I feel like it's really for anybody who needs that like 1-2 punch of black girl magic and black girl badassery all at the same time. For too often, the literary canon has catered to Anglo-Saxon white boys and white men, and I feel like it's time to change that. And I think that L.L. McKinney taking something from that canon and giving it a twist that makes it more inclusive of demographics of people who just haven't been centered in stories is really, really important. And I think that she did it with a very deft hand. It's got the action, it's got the romance, it's got the whimsicality and the magic of Wonderland. And overall, I think the Nightmareverse is a standout in the YA urban fantasy being published in modern day, and I hope that you will pick it up. And there you have it, folks. That is my review of the Nightmareverse by L.L. McKinney. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please leave me a thumbs up, and if you like me, maybe consider subscribing to my channel. I post videos every Thursday, and I'd love to have you join my little bookish family. Comment down below if you've read the Nightmareverse, because I would love to gush about this with somebody who I can get into all the nitty-gritty about it with. Or if commenting is too much, please leave me one of the 4 card suits in the emoji. So a spade, a club, a heart, or a diamond. And if you choose a heart, please make sure to make it red. But regardless, that is it for me for now. Thank you again so much for watching, and I will see you at the next video very, very soon. Goodbye.